The hearing will come to order. The Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee meets today to review Department of Army's modernization programs for the fiscal 2020 budget request. The Army has made significant changes, and that's an understatement, and some very tough choices with regards to the 20 request to fund future capabilities without asking for an increase to their budget top line. Our subcommittee intends to examine the rationale behind these choices with the senior Army leaders that we have with us today. I would like to welcome our distinguished panel witnesses. Dr. Bruce Jetty, Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisitions, Logistics, and Technology. General John Murray, Commanding General, Army Futures Command, and I'd like to thank both of you for meeting us up at Picatinny and spending the day with us. Very informative and very helpful. Also joining us is Lieutenant General James Pasquarette, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, G8, and Mr. John Ludwigson, Director of Contracts and National Security Acquisitions, Government Accountability Office. Thank you for joining us today. I know we're all looking forward to your testimony, and this is something that has been very much on top of everybody's mind because of the scrubbing that the Army has done over the course of the last year. Subcommittee will review a broad portfolio of Army ground, aviation, ammunition, and air missile defense, and soldier individual equipment programs. The Army's fiscal 2020 modernization request, research and development acquisition programs total $34 billion, essentially in line with last year's enacted amount. Though the Army's modernization top line did not change, the program funded under these accounts certainly did. Subcommittee wants to learn about these changes, the reasoning behind it, and the associated risks that was taken or improved. To fund the future modernization priorities, the Army leadership conducted a year-long examination of all research and development procurement programs, weighing the cost and benefits of each against the Army's current needs and with the anticipated future threats in support of the new National Defense Strategy. Some 180 programs were deemed less relevant, that is certainly a relative term, to our strategy and or not as capable as a replacement, therefore not worth the expense. They were cut from the fiscal 2020 request. One of the subcommittee goals today is to better understand the context, the analysis behind those decisions. One significant program reduction involves an upgrade to the CH-47F Chinook helicopter. Despite having invested significant funds to develop the Block II aircraft with greater lift, increased range capabilities, the Army deferred the program indefinitely, using the assumption that the aviation community would absorb the risk to the heavy lift mission and the industrial base will somehow weather this loss. Subcommittee expects to hear more about the Army, how you reach these conclusions, and how the service intends to manage this risk going forward. Army modernization has had a rocky road. The Army leaders with us today are familiar with that, and the history and are committed to a new way of planning, managing modernization. Most important, the Army leaders have recognized for the future standing up of the Army Futures Command, General Murray's new command and creating of the cross-functional teams to identify and develop solutions to serve the top 6 modernization priorities. They are long-range precision fire, next-generation combat vehicle, future vertical lift, Army network, air and missile defense, and soldier lethality. The committee expects to hear how the fiscal 2020 request will address these modernization priorities and align acquisition with the National Defense Strategy. We also want to know what will be different this time. And we've had this conversation so many times we've gone through this and somehow expecting it would change. Many are describing that this feels different, and certainly we want to make sure, A, it's sustainable and it's working the way that it's designed. What new processes or internal oversight will ensure the Army gets its money worth in this wide-reaching modernization endeavor? We're interested in the distribution of responsibility, the authority, as well as the relationship Dr. Jetty's organization, ASALT, and the Army's Future Command and the Army staff. How will these three organizations work together and prioritize and come out with one correct decision? Given congressional and DoD interest in improved acquisition, the Army has enthusiastically embraced rapid prototyping authorities granted by Congress to speed innovation, shorten development cycles for those key technologies. While this subcommittee supports the use of so-called the 804 authorities and other transaction authority, we also want to be sure that these rapid prototyping approaches are used in the spirit of good acquisition processes and practices. They yield real measurable results. Buying too many of the same design prototype while the test and evaluation phase might not be the best use of taxpayers' money. The committee will conduct oversight in these areas to ensure the prototype-related funding is programmed and spent in a reasonable manner. And of course, GAO has extensive knowledge of the Army acquisition, past, present, and understands those challenges. Subcommittee is interested in the GAO assessment of the Army Futures Command, which is in your packet, and its role driving innovation and the relationship to the rest of the Army acquisition community. We look forward to your testimony to discuss these topics. Before we begin, I'd like to turn to the ranking member, the distinguished lady from Missouri, who we had a chance to be in her district a couple weeks ago, and looking forward to your comments, Ms. Harshler.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we look forward to you coming back so we can go to Fort Leonard Wood as well and see that very important Army installation. But thank you so much for being here and to provide his testimony in the Army modernization efforts and the fiscal year 2020 budget request. The National Defense Strategy directs our military to prepare for the return of a great power competition with strategic, near-peer, and I would say equal-peer, almost competitors, like Russia and China. The Secretary of the Army has noted this budget request represents an inflection point for the Army. And in order to meet these National Defense Strategy objectives, the Army needs to rapidly modernize now. Overall, it appears the Army's modernization request continues to build on the progress made in the previous two budgets in rebuilding, readiness, and modernization. This is important because Army modernization funding declined by well over 50% from 2008 through 2016 as a result of the drawdown from two wars and the imposition of the budget caps by the Budget Control Act. Most of this impact was seen in the later stages of the R&D accounts, such as prototyping and system development stages, which are the precursors to fielding new capabilities. So I'm pleased that this budget request continues to request needed growth in modernization. The Army's modernization request includes $12.2 billion in research, development, test, and evaluation funding, and $21.8 billion in procurement, which will begin to address the Army's identified top 6 modernization priorities, which the chairman listed. In building this year's budget request, I understand senior Army leadership reviewed and scrutinized every program to determine which ones supported the National Defense Strategy and which programs could be reduced or canceled so that savings could be reinvested into the Army's Big 6, quote, priorities. Obviously, tough choices had to be made, and while we may not agree with every decision the Army made, we can commend the Army for making these tough decisions in order to prioritize limited investment funding for the future fight and effectively begin to operationalize the National Defense Strategy. I would like our witnesses today to provide additional details on this process and help us understand how you are managing strategic risk as a result of these decisions, to include operationally as well as impacts to the industrial base. Since we met last year to review the Army's modernization request, the Army's Future Command has reached initial operational capability, congratulations, and is well underway in developing modernization requirements to meet these future threats. We expect witnesses today to provide an update on how the Futures Command has begun to improve the acquisition and modernization process. To support this effort, I understand the Army has also established 8 cross-functional teams that align with the Army's modernization priorities. These CFTs are pursuing 31 separate lines of effort with over $8.8 billion total requested for these efforts in the budget. I expect our witnesses today to provide updates on these efforts. Given this focus on next-generation capabilities, I'd like our witnesses today to discuss how the Army is balancing investments and capabilities for the future fight, while at the same time upgrading legacy platforms for current threats. Finally, I want to stress the importance of having a defense top line that represents real growth. We cannot afford to go backwards, and the level of funding in this budget request is the minimum required to continue repairing our military. So I thank the chairman for organizing this important hearing, and I go back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Counselor. I understand. Followed by General Murray and Lieutenant General Pasquarette. And then Mr. Ludwigson will provide a perspective from the GAO that everybody's looking forward to. And without objection, each of the witness prepared statements will be included in the record. Hearing none, so ordered. So, Dr. Jetty, you can lead off and share with us something we've been looking forward to, how the midnight scrub reallocated much of what we do. And on our platter are 300 requests from fellow members to make those adjustments a little bit different. So we have before us quite a challenge, and we want to make sure we hear the rationale, the risk, and where we're going.
Chairman Norcross, Ranking Member Hartzler, and distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Tactical Air Land Forces, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the Army's modernization priorities and the resources we have requested for the FY20 President's budget. Before I begin, on behalf of the Army family, I would like to extend our deepest sympathies on the passing of Congresswoman Ellen Tusher. She had a very distinguished career as a public servant and was a true friend and supporter of the Army. We share the sadness of your loss. For nearly 2 decades, the Army has deferred high-intensity combat capability modernization in order to support continuous low to medium-intensity operations, while the global security environment has grown more competitive and volatile. Army senior leaders identified our budget, organization, acquisition, and talent management as central to ensuring unquestionable superiority. In all of these, one primary objective guided us: make soldiers and units more capable and lethal to deter conflict or win decisively if necessary. The FY20 budget request before you is the first budget in decades to fully fund the modernization priorities. Through a series of introspective assessments of existing programs as they contribute to our primary objective, we eliminated, reduced, or consolidated nearly 200 programs, reallocating the funding to more essential modernization priorities rather than asking Congress for additional funding. Army leadership recognized the need for fundamental change to better employ those resources. A revitalized future force modernization enterprise was necessary. Last year, the Army made its most significant organizational restructuring in over 40 years by establishing the Army Futures Command. As a result, one commander is driving support for the NDS through concept development, experimentation, modeling and simulation, organizational design, requirements determination, and material solution validation. Through the cross-functional teams, AFC remains laser-focused on the 6 modernization priorities. The Office of the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology retains management and control over all aspects of material development and procurement. However, the establishment AFC affords an opportunity to create a more collaborative working environment between the CFTs and the program executive offices. Each CFT has a PEO. The 30 signature systems of the CFT each have a program manager. Of greatest value is the collaboration. AFC and the CFT participate in deliberation over acquisition strategies. Equally, the acquisition community contributes to the operational and requirements development process. Yet, each retain their responsibilities. While retaining management and control of funding at the ASALT level, Army Science and Technology funding, 6.1 through 6.3, is managed for execution by AFC, to which the Army Organic Technology Base is assigned, Army Research Office, Army Research Laboratory, Combat Capabilities and Development Directorate, Command. As the Army Chief Scientist, I am personally involved in the technology strategies and planning. Advanced component development and prototyping, $6.4, remain managed by the PEOs and PMs, but with the objective of fulfilling AFC experimentation, modeling and simulation, and prototyping in order to facilitate a more seamless transition to programs of record. The Army continues to responsibly implement acquisition initiatives that Congress authorized, such as Section 804 Middle Tier Acquisition and other transaction authorities. We established an intellectual property policy that protects the equities of both the government and private industry to encourage inventive and innovative companies to work with the Army. We have a draft transition to sustainment policy with execution plan currently under test to better manage resources and are working on a transition to divestiture for obsolete equipment. Our advanced manufacturing policy will help reduce part stockages and time to repair, and we believe size of the sustainment tail in general. And with the complexities of emerging battlefield, ASALT has drafted a revised talent management program for acquisition professionals that, particularly in the case of officers, stretches back to ROTC and West Point. Thank you again for this opportunity to discuss the Army's modernization priorities and for your strong support of the Army's programs. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Norcross, Ranking Member Hartzler, distinguished members of the Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and thank you for your longtime steadfast support and demonstrated commitment to our soldiers, our civilians, and their families. And Ranking Member Hartzler, the United States Army is indeed at a strategic inflection point. Both Russia and China have begun a very aggressive modernization program for their armies. Up until this point, and really the last couple of years, the United States Army has not, and we are in danger of falling behind. The Army established Army Futures Command to provide unity of effort and to make sure that the Army becomes a continually modernizing organization. The key is unified and integrated approach to develop and deliver operational concepts, future force designs, and material solutions that support those concepts. Army Futures Command has postured the Army for the future by setting strategic direction, integrating the future force modernization enterprise, aligning resources to Army priorities, and maintaining accountability. In doing so, Army Futures Command works hand in hand with the Assistant Secretary of the Army, Acquisition, Logistics, and Technology, Dr. Jetty, and the Army G8 led by Lieutenant General Jim Pasquarette. The Army's new concept, Multi-Domain Operations 2028, is the foundation for the Army's modernization plan. This concept articulates how the Army, as part of the joint force and with our allies, will compete with and, if necessary, defeat near-peer adversaries as directed in the National Defense Strategy. The Army's next modernization strategy will be published this summer. It will describe how the Army will continually modernize to become a multi-domain capable force by 2028 and a multi-domain ready force by 2035. As mentioned, Army Futures Command has 8 cross-functional teams that are powerful tools for modernization. These teams directly align with the Army's modernization priorities, and the initiatives that they oversee are the critical first steps of Army modernization. Each team is led by a general officer or senior executive and directly partnered with both the program manager and the program executive officer. And this team brings together all the relevant communities to work together from the earliest stages of the process, from requirements to science and technology, testing and evaluation, costing, resourcing, contracting, and logistics, so we have the opportunity to get it right from the beginning. We are already seeing results of these efforts. The new enhanced night vision goggle binocular with a requirements document about 12 months ago will be fielded to Army formation this fall and deployed to the Republic of Korea. And additionally, mobile short-range air defense requirements document about 2 years ago is on track for initial fielding in FY20. I am absolutely confident that our Army will have the concepts, capabilities, and organizational structures that it needs to fulfill our mission on the nation's behalf. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. General Pasquarette?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Norcross, Ranking Member Hartzler, distinguished members of this subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak about the fiscal year 2020 Army modernization budget. You will find no daylight between the National Defense Strategy and the areas we are investing in to ensure the U.S. Army maintains land force dominance in the future versus near-peer competitors. This year's budget request is driven by the Army strategy, and if fully funded, will enable the Army to meet its modernization priority objectives by 2028 in support of the NDS. In building the FY20 budget, the Secretary of the Army and Chief of Staff recognized that future defense budgets would likely remain relatively flat or potentially decline. So rather than asking for additional resources, they chose to reprioritize resources from within the Army's projected top line to pay for near-term readiness and next-generation modernization. As mentioned, the Army leadership personally reviewed over 500 programs. Those that did not directly contribute to lethality or were assessed as ineffective against near-peer threats in the envisioned future operational environment became a funding source. In the end, this process and the implementation of aggressive reforms and efficiencies resulted in the reprioritization of over $30 billion across the FY20 FYDP in favor of modernization priorities. These decisions, while not easy, were necessary to put the Army on an azimuth to maintain land dominance given the acknowledged return of great power competition with Russia and China. Let me close by saying that the realization of our modernization objectives is highly dependent on what is in the FY20 budget request by the Army. The investments in this budget request complement and reinforce what was jump-started in the FY18 and 19 budgets, of which we thank Congress for their great support. Finally, with continued predictable, adequate, timely, and sustained funding, the U.S. Army will continue to be the best-equipped land force the world has ever known. I sincerely appreciate your time today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ludwigson?
Chairman Norcross, Ranking Member Hartzler, and members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss Army's modernization. I will summarize my written statement, which draws upon 3 prior modernization-related reports. My statement today will provide observations on 3 broad topics. First, the organizational changes occurring with modernization. Second, some positive aspects of modernization we've seen. And third, some steps the Army should take while modernizing. Regarding the organizational change, as a part of modernization, the Army is substantially restructuring, including the creation of the new 4-star Army Futures Command, which seeks to integrate and connect the forward-looking components of Army. This restructuring also aims to improve how requirements are developed, something GAO and others have identified as part of the problem with past failed modernization efforts. Despite these steps, Army modernization remains very much in process. While Futures Command has begun operating, it's not expected to be fully operational until this summer, and efforts aimed at modernizing Army's capabilities are considerable and could take a decade or longer to be realized. While modernization is just starting, I would like to highlight 3 positive aspects. First, we've seen a strong organizational commitment to modernization across senior levels of Army and Futures Command, and the Army has begun to follow relevant leading practices for organizational change we've identified. Also, we see the establishment of cross-functional teams as offering the promise of improving modernization efforts. These teams are intended to guide progress towards the Army's 6 modernization priorities while pulling in new ideas from industry and academia, identifying opportunities to experiment and prototype, and identifying opportunities to improve the acquisition process. These teams bring together stakeholders with diverse expertise, including requirements, contracting, cost analysis, and the potential users of these weapon systems. These teams bring together stakeholders earlier than the traditional process, where stakeholders provided their input sequentially and later. These teams have also generally followed relevant leading practices we'd identified. Finally, we see Army taking steps to realign research and development investments with its modernization priorities. Identifying and maturing technologies to address capability needs takes time, and ensuring that these efforts are directed at modernization efforts early is important. I would like to mention 4 changes the Army should consider as it modernizes. First, the Army and Futures Command could do more to broaden the organizational commitment to restructuring by more clearly seeking to leverage the strengths and experiences of existing organizations and formalizing coordination with organizations who do not directly report to Futures Command but are instrumental to the success of the modernization enterprise. For example, Futures Command had not yet until recently, finalized details of how it will work with the Civilian Acquisition Authority, and I think is still working through some of those issues. Second, the Army should improve the transparency of its near-term modernization efforts as we recommended in 2018 by establishing a plan for evaluating how near-term modernization investments contribute to its modernization goal and finalizing its estimate of near-term investments and providing all of those estimates to Congress. Third, the Army should ensure it has enough key personnel to support the work of modernization, as we recommended in 2017. At that time, we reported that Army had declining levels of acquisition personnel who helped develop requirements. With the expected increased pace of modernization, the Army should evaluate whether they have enough of these key personnel. Finally, the Army should commit to using mature technologies in new weapon systems, as we recommended earlier this year. Past failed modernization efforts have left the Army with equipment in need of an update. Developing new weapon systems using mature technologies would lower the risks associated with updating its capabilities compared with its past practice of developing these integrated weapon systems while maturing the underlying technologies. In conclusion, the Army has taken promising early steps to address some of the reasons it has struggled with past modernization efforts, but it could do more. GAO stands ready to help the Congress as they oversee these important efforts. Chairman Norcross, Ranking Member Hartzler, this concludes my statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions that subcommittee members may have.
Thank you, and certainly for the report, which went to each of the offices, dated January 2019. So there's some positive, very positive things in there, but there are certainly some challenges. It's still very new, and you've pointed that out. So I'm going to start out. I'll just go with two general questions. First one more aspirational on how the design and the way it was supposed to work and the way we think it's working now. Hard scrub over the course of the last year. What fits into our new priorities? So first question is, when the programs were reviewed, you're measuring against the 6 priorities that we set forth. Risk is assessed across the board. Are you using the same risk assessment for each of the programs, or does that risk change based on the program as you move forward? So, General Murray, let's start with you, and then Dr. Teddy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would actually start the process a little bit earlier. So the risk has to start to be assessed against what the Army has been told to do in the National Defense Strategy, and then
Right.
the concept that we have come up with to allow the Army to fight and win on a future battlefield. So that's when we looked at, and both Dr. Jett and I were part of the process a year ago or a year and a half ago, that the process you're talking about. The senior leaders, and you've heard this number before, for 60-plus hours over the course of probably 2 months, so it wasn't 60 straight hours, obviously. And I was the G8 at that time, and most of this staff was mine, but between the 600 to 800 hours of analysis that went in to prepare for those 60 hours, each system was looked at against with a common lens. Does this contribute to how the Army will fight in 2028 to 2035? And if the answer was no, it will not contribute, that was kind of an easy place to look for resources.
That's only one half of the equation. The other half is, what risk are we assuming?
I'm getting there, sir. So obviously there's risk to the industrial base, and I'm going to allow Dr. J to talk about that. You know, my role was primarily to look at it from an operational risk, and there is risk. If, are you going to be able to maintain that piece of equipment? Because it's not like you just divest of something and automatically produce something out of the air to replace it. So how much risk are you assuming with a legacy piece of equipment while we get new equipment in place? That was looked at. And the 31, I think you said, efforts that the cross-functional teams are looking at, those were the key capabilities to allow us to fight and win on a future battlefield, FY 2028, along with the organizational structure. And so when you look at it with that lens, what is most important for the United States Army to protect this nation, that was the operational lens we looked at it from.
Mr. Chairman, as General Murray said, the acquisition side was considered at the same time that the operational side was considered. So the first place that was confirmed was the value to the operational forces. Once that was made, then we took a look at the impact of programmatics and the impact of the industrial base. So, for example, if a technology currently existed and we looked at it from programmatic basis, could we end the contract? Could we reduce the contract? What would the impact of doing either of those steps have on the contract value, so that we were honest and upfront about what type of harvesting might be made in the budget out years. So we didn't want to go into this and assume that something may be $10 million, we're going to cancel it, and we're going to get $10 million back, when in fact we had obligations that may be $8 million of it. So you're only going to harvest 2. And that may be worth the risk, and it may not, and those type of things were considered. A second piece of consideration that was done in each of these was to take a look at the risk of terminating or curtailing a program to the continued sustainment of the existing program. So, as you know, in many cases, we have large quantities of equipment. If I terminate a continuing upgrade to a particular set of equipment, now I have to change from an upgrade strategy, being able to compensate for my sustainment aging. I now have to be able to adjust to just a sustainment mode. And we took a look at that, again, in the same light. What's affordability and what's the industrial base going to be able to sustain? And then we did take a look at the industrial base and the risks there on both sides. So the first side would be, were we losing an industrial base? Would we have a risk that we may be putting out? Vendors may not be able to survive after a period of time. What would we do for those parts? Conversely, did we believe that the industrial base would be able to grow in the new venture, whatever that might be that we're producing?
So who put together the impact to the industrial base, those procurement definitions, the minimum sustaining rate? Who actually puts that together, and what time frame?
Okay, so there are 2 questions there. I just want to make sure that I answer them correctly, sir. In the case of taking a look at the industrial base, the acquisition community, I have a large staff. We put together our assessments of where we thought things were. I have a Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army that does.
Is that in conjunction with industry or outside of it?
The initial assessment is always done internally, so that we have a pretty flat view of what we think is out there. That way, we don't necessarily run into industry's interest in a particular direction. We want to make sure that we know what we think is right. Then we will talk to industry, and we do. I meet with the Secretary has a continuing program every Monday evening. Most every Monday evening, we'll meet with an industry CEO and president. We discuss these things with them. And then my door is always open, and I have a lot of people who come through it.
I probably an understatement on going through. So we've literally spent tens of billions on modernizing the Army. Critical to both Army and DOD that are we getting the return on our investment? And that can be measured several ways. So the question, is the Army assessing its return on modernization? It's very new. Is it working as you originally designed it and expected? And to layer on top of that, the relationships between general and the doctor is different now. Is that working? Is that relationship? Do we need to define it any better? So those are 2 questions.
Yes, sir. So as you mentioned, I mean, I like to describe Army Futures Command as a startup trying to manage a merger right now. So it is very new. And I would say that it is working because we are showing some early success with what the cross-functional teams are working on. I mentioned some of that, just some opening statements. Another example would be, historically, if you look back over time, it was taking the Army 3 to 5 years just to get a requirement approved in the first place before it even went over to acquisition. We're averaging 3 to 5 months, and that is a significant reduction in the time it's taken to get requirements approved. Mr. McCarthy and General McConville started a lot of this for us, but we're carrying on that process to make sure that we are moving at the speed of relevance to get capability to our soldiers. Dr. Jetty and I had a good relationship before. The G8 and the ASALT, the Acquisition Logistics and Technology Assistant Secretary, have a relationship. I used to spend at least one day a week in his office, and we can compare notes. And I would just say, and I think he would agree, that the relationship is only getting better and will continue to get better in terms of how we approach this. And I think the key thing there is we both have the common end state of making sure, and it's not today's soldiers, that future soldiers have what they need to fight and win on a future battlefield.
If I may, sir.
Is it defined as well as you would like to see it?
Sir, I think that, I think I mentioned in our visit up to Picatinny, when you have such a change, you have storming, forming, and norming. And I think a reasonable description of where we are, we're past the storming. There are no hurricanes anymore. We still have a tornado roll by every so often. We discover some conflict between the two organizations and how we do business, and General Murray and I then get together and try to resolve that. And so far, we've been very successful. As we do that, we're beginning to codify those relationships and different methodologies. For example, the PMs and PEOs that are linked together weren't sure of exactly how that was going to work. Do they have, and it is taking a bit of a cultural difference. In the past, as I mentioned, there was, you did requirements, you did the acquisition, and that's how we met. Now, literally, they come together to work through those things. And so the acquisition people have the authority to sit there and say, listen, that's great, but that's not achievable in that time frame. Or you could achieve this if you just ask for it. Conversely, the requirements side of things can say, well, why can't we do this? And how come you're holding up the acquisition process that way when couldn't we try something else? So we are trying to find even more aggressive methods of working more closely together as opposed to against each other.
I know my colleagues want to ask some questions. Before I turn it over. So I want to look at the Block 2, the Chinook, as an example. I got into a little bit more, and we're going to get into the weeds when we start making those assessments of risk. So it's, as proposed, indefinitely put off for that. So we were out in Phoenix 2 weeks ago and learned that the decision to cancel this, the upgrades, was made without input from the contractor, which is what you explained to me that you do, is that phase one, it's your staff that comes up with that. But then you go after that to industry. So on the CH-47F, the assessment was made, and the minimum requirements to keep a line going is something that your office put out first. If there's a difference, significant, between what your assessment is and what industry who's on the floor, how is that rectified or addressed?
So let me make sure I just clarify one detail, sir. The quantities, actually quantities that we want for a given year are not defined by the acquisition community, but by the requirements. So General Murray would bring that in.
This is in order to keep,
yes, sir,
whatever the program is, the minimum sustaining rate, right, which is what you publish.
Yes, sir. So the minimum sustaining rate is arrived at by discussing that with the contractor. It is an open discussion. We don't always agree on what we believe the numbers should be. And I'm not sure we're done with fully understanding that in the case of the Chinook. At the same time, we are looking at, so when we say we're not doing the F model, it's not that we're not doing any Block 2. We're doing Block 2 for the G model, which is basically an F model converted to the Special Ops community.
Right.
And so we add those into the mix over a period of time.
That's 80 a year, I believe?
6, sir.
6.
And then on top of that, we've been supportive of FMS, foreign military sales, and there are a number of them that fill those. We are looking at other potential opportunities to bring partners into the mix. to help us with some of the quantities right now. And I think the Secretary made it clear that in his discussions that this is a halt. It's a halt to try and find out where we need to go with respect to the new, to a true future technology for heavy future vertical lift. That doesn't necessarily exclude the 47 Block 2, or an alternative variant along. It's just a statement to slow down, stop. Let's make reassessments and make sure that we're spending the taxpayers' dollars appropriately to meet the future vertical heavy lift needs.
And the reason I'm going into this is that if you arrive at it separately or individual, but they're close. On this one, they're saying you need 24-year minimum to keep the line open. So if that's part of your risk assessment and it's radically different, that would potentially change the outcome of that decision-making. So I'm going to move on, but that's one of the areas that if you're using that tool and we have that big of a discrepancy, and this just happens to be this one, what's the correction factor? How do we go after it? But we'll talk about that later on. Mrs. Hartzler.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think it really is refreshing what you have done already. I mean, it's very impressive that Army leadership personally reviewed over 500 programs, weighing the benefits and looking into the future. I like what you said, General, that it's a startup trying to manage a merger. I think that's pretty good. And the example of how you've already been able to reduce from 3 to 5 years to 3 to 5 months some of the requirements. I mean, that's impressive. So this is a great example of probably what we need to do all over government, is stop and look and before we move forward. I did want to give you, first of all, General Murray and Dr. Jetty, an opportunity to address some of the concerns laid out by Mr. Ludwigson, the GAO, and they did give you a lot of positives of things they're seeing that they feel good about, but there was 4 areas he mentioned. So regarding to the amount of personnel, do you have enough that you need? Transparency on how you evaluate the modernization efforts. I think maybe that was some of the discussion we just had. And technologies, ways to reduce risk, to ensure that they're fully mature. So anything you would like to respond to those concerns that were laid out?
Thank you, ma'am. And I obviously have seen all those GAO reports, and I was on the chopping line either as a G8 or the Army Futures Command, and the Army, I believe, went back and concurred with every one of those recommendations, and I personally concur with every one of those recommendations. I think the first one, that the ongoing relationship between outside organizations, ASALT is one of them. There's other organizations within OSD and within academia and within commercial industry that those relationships are being built, and there's and also within key universities throughout the country. So for artificial intelligence, we have established a presence at Carnegie Mellon University to begin to learn how to incorporate artificial intelligence into the way forward. Obviously, some key universities in Texas, we have some presence and some partnerships. And so those are ongoing. So I do believe that those things kind of take time, but we are in the process of establishing some non-traditional relationships, if you will, to include some innovation hubs all around the country. In the plan to determine, the value of the investments against the end state is the way I kind of took that. I think you have to look at the timing of the report. It was prior to this budget, and as Dr. Jetty mentioned, this is the first budget we have presented to the Hill that I think clearly lays out where our priorities are in terms of modernization. I know there's also a question about investments in legacy programs and how they contribute, and I think we continue to work to define very analytically how our investments are aligned against that end state that I talked about earlier. The people, and I think that, the requirements community is a pretty broad community, and I think that's where the comment mostly was on the requirements, and it's systems engineers and operational research systems and analysis, our ORSA population. I just last Friday, I had all my requirements people come to Austin, and we sat down and talked about their needs. And there is an element that is under strength throughout the requirements community, and has been probably since budgets were pretty lean at the sequester year and during the 16, 17, 18 timeframe. And so we are taking a holistic look at what is required for the requirements community, trying to capitalize on the lessons of the CFTs, which is also highlighted. And then on mature tech, I obviously am a huge fan of mature tech before you move to a program of record, but I think it can't be a one-size-fits-all. I think you got to take it on a case-by-case basis. Going back to risk, you got to kind of look at the risk of letting that technology mature. But we definitely do not want to go back to betting on some very immature technologies and baking programs around those immature technologies, which has gotten us in trouble in the past.
Sure, and getting those stakeholders, including the users involved in developing the requirement is really important. Wanted to talk about a little bit the lessons learned and best practices that Army Futures Command has been able to identify to date and planning incorporates as you march toward full operational capability this year. That includes examples of working with small business. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit, what you're doing with small businesses?
Yes, ma'am. So in a couple instances, one would be Army Applications Lab, which is also located in Austin, Texas. And if you're familiar with the Defense Innovation Unit, it's not a carbon copy of it, but it's focused on outreach to small businesses and innovation throughout the country. One of the things that I think is very promising, just as an example, that we discovered through Army Applications Lab is the opportunity to inject virtual reality training into our basic pilot training. The Air Force has done this, and they're a little bit ahead of the Army, but we're going to stand up a pilot at Fort Rucker this summer, and we believe that we can significantly reduce the amount of actual flight hours with no degradation in the training. And when you reduce flight hours, you have the potential of probably every class saving tens of millions of dollars in terms of sustainment of aircraft, those hours you're not actually flying.
That's amazing. Dr. Jetty and General Pascaret, the Next Generation Squad weapon program is requiring a new caliber to be used in these weapons, a 6.8 millimeter round. I understand the ammunition is going to be produced at Lake City Army Ammunition Plant. Could you update us on this effort, and do you require any additional funding in fiscal year 2020 for additional tooling or modernized equipment at Lake City, which is near my district? Many of my constituents work there. I'm very proud of the mission there.
Well, I would talk, ma'am, thanks. I would talk in a broad sense on any of our efforts that General Murray is shepherding as the AFC commander to include next-gen squad weapon. When the requirement has been identified and validated, we have fully funded it in this program to include in FY20. So there are near-term adjustments that are out there with the Chief's UFR that I believe is this, and I have to check on this, but it might be with this system we're talking about here. But those were new, that's new information since we submitted this program and budget down to OSD. And so that's why there might be minor adjustments. But programmatically, it's fully funded based on the requirements that we know today.
Dr. J?
Yes, ma'am. You're right. The new round is going to be a different size and shape. We haven't confirmed exactly what the final shape will be. Because we still have a competition for the weapon to move forward. We want to have a common round between the two weapons, the automatic and the rifle. We then will have to go back in and review the development of the hardware that's necessary to produce the round specifically. But at this point, I don't believe that we see any additional funding that's necessary in the 20 budget in order to accommodate that for production.
Great, thank you. Dr. Jetty and General Murray, if the United States withdraws from the INF Treaty in August in response to ongoing Russian violations, does the Army intend to remove the previously imposed range restriction for long-range precision fires that complied with the treaty?
And ma'am, if I could, I'd just go back to your last question. There was a 19 mark against the rifle that caused this a quarter slip if it's not restored. And I think that was what the request was. Okay. And yes, ma'am, we are looking at that. Obviously, the treaty is still in place until August when the 6-month period runs out for, I guess, to change your mind. But within specifically the precision strike missile, which is the ATACMS replacement, ATACMS 350, Right now, we say PRISM is 499.9 to stay within the INF treaty. We are already planning future upgrades to get well beyond 500 if the treaty is not in place.
Great. Thank you. I have more, but I'll wait for the second round. Yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of you for being here today. General Pascaret, the Army has emphasized the necessity to invest sufficient funding into its modernization priorities. In your written statement, you mentioned that the Army has protected key legacy systems. Just trying to get some insight as to how that process ensued. How did the Army determine which programs to protect? 2, what was the analysis that supported the selection of these systems? And 3, who were the Army leaders and program representatives involved in those discussions and decisions?
Well, it was, some of it we've talked a little bit, sir, but I'll recount a little bit of it and then a little more detail. The analysis was conducted, was kicked off by our analytical agencies back when Russia actually, the intervention in Crimea had us take a hard look at what are our requirements to deal with Russia. That was our first wake-up call as we were trying to, still committed fairly heavily in Iraq and Afghanistan, but that was the leading analytical assessment by our Center for Army Analysis and TRAC and others. That informed eventually what was produced in the NDS and identified our capability requirements we need that General Murray is leading, the 6 modernization priorities, but it also looked at our near-term gaps based on op plans of our legacy systems that we needed to invest in today also. That produced the need to upgrade our armored brigade combat teams as an example. When we looked at requirements versus Russia, and what we have ended up doing, and as a result of that, is coming up with a strategy to modernize our armored brigade combat teams at a rate of 1 to 1.5 a year in this program here as a result of that analysis. So those are legacy systems that we've been on in one form or fashion for several decades that we'll upgrade them incrementally to keep them as good as they can be. In some ways, integrated to what Futures Command will bring online over time and will replace. An example is the Future Ground Combat Vehicle eventually will replace the Bradley as an example. So I think that is an example. Our Stryker fleet is another one that we'll have Strykers in our formation until at least 2035. And we're investing about $750 million a year roughly in our Strykers across the FIDEP to keep them as incrementally as good as they can be out for the next 15 or 20 years.
And sir, I'll just add on, and General Pascaret makes a great point. The reality is we have to be ready to do both. We have to be ready to fight tomorrow, and we have to be ready to fight in the future. And that's an element of the risk that when you look at, I mean, do you upgrade a system or do you not upgrade a system? Because it is not an endless pot of money, and the Army's not asking for that. We're going to have to make some financial decisions based upon the concepts that I talked about earlier that have been run through modeling and simulation to the point where we are confident that with multi-domain operations, with certain organizational structures, with the key things we're trying to pursue in modern systems, we can get to a win on a future battlefield. And so it's been through extensive modeling and simulation, experimentation, if you will, to determine that. The senior leaders, Dr. Jetty was there, I was there as the G8, the Secretary of the Army was there, the Chief of Staff of the Army was there, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army was there, the Undersecretary of the Army was there, the FORSCOM 4-star commander was there, the AMC, Army Material Command 4-star commander was there, the Training and Doctrine Command 4-star commander was there, plus experts from Dr. Jetty's side and experts from the requirements side to make sure that we stay grounded. But the decision-making was really the board of directors, if you will, for the United States Army.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ludwigson, many Army leaders at various levels have stated that the service will now pursue incremental acquisitions that are good enough, quote unquote, rather than exquisite solutions that solve all problems. Does GAO support this path to capabilities development?
Thank you, sir. I think that we're very positive as it relates to incremental acquisitions. I think that one of the pivots that is helpful is to shift from aspirational acquisitions to thinking agile. And the way to meet our recommendation as it related to implementing with mature technologies is to recognize that you build now what you can and you invest for the future and you add what's available when it's available, rather than building that into program of record. And then if it doesn't work out, particularly if it's a critical technology, ending up not being able to deliver on time and on schedule.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll apologize in advance for my cynicism. General Murray, thank you for your patience. We talked about some of the things. I'm still trying to come to grips with the CH-47 Block 2, and we'll probably have this conversation. I heard one of the comments about some of these things might take decades. I can't think in terms of that, not the way the Chinese and the Russians are modernizing, particularly the Chinese. We don't have decades. And so I'm probably very, very impatient. I think what you're doing, I think, is outstanding, and I want to give you a compliment. On a number of years ago, I was one of those ones that was beating the drum about the active protection systems and this and that, and got a lot of pushback, and of course, I used the Israeli scenario. And we got 4 brigades that have them right now. What's the prognosis for the rest? Are we still looking to flush that out, or?
The requirement is every combat vehicle has active protective system eventually. So we're exploring. Trophy is the system you're talking about. It is too heavy for our Bradleys and Strikers, so we're right now in the process of proving out a different system. And then for the next generation combat vehicle, the Bradley replacement, one of the threshold requirements is an integrated active protective system.
You know, I know the Dutch had something for their APCs. I don't know whether they did, but as long as you're looking at other systems like that, I'm very, very happy. And just the fact that, I guess, Iron Dome, you have that cross-pollination. Are you also exploring some of those systems that I just mentioned?
Iron Dome specifically, the air defense system? Yes, sir. So I think it was the 18 NDAA directed the Army to field 2 batteries by FY20. There is an ATR associated with it. It's not above threshold reprogramming. It's not additional dollars. We need to turn some RDT dollars into procurement dollars. That is on the Hill right now. And if we can get kind consideration that in a relatively timely fashion, we think we're on track to meet 2 batteries by 20 and additional 2 batteries by 23.
I think that'll be great. Vertical lift, future vertical lift. These timelines on whether you fish or cut bait or how we're going to do this, we're talking about a lot of money or where we're going. Are we going to be fed in on that a little bit so you can help us in terms of, you know, because we're going to make recommendations on the budget and everything else, and this is very, very important. So could you comment on that a little bit?
Absolutely, sir. And as you know, there's 2 versions of future vertical lift we're working on right now. Some call it Cape Sep 1. We're now calling it FARA, the Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft, and then FLARA, which is the Future Long Range Assault Aircraft. Roughly speaking, the first one I talked about is a Scout, which we divested our Scout aircraft based upon obsolescence.
More Kyle.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Which is a critical gap we're seeing in a future fight, so that is our #1 priority. And then the second one is really a medium lift helicopter that would replace the Black Hawk, which is very, very vulnerable. Apaches will be in the fleet for a long time, and then the CH-47, when we went through the analysis, it is the youngest fleet we have in terms of production, and it met the operational requirements we were looking at. And I understand your position. My position is it meets the requirement we'd have in the near future. And so, but the two future vertical lift aircraft are the Army's priorities, with the first one being FARA, the second one being FLARA, and we would be happy. And we spend a lot of time over here already both Dr. Jetty's staff and mine, so the staffers fully understand where we're trying to go with those two aircraft.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. By the way, they didn't give me my gouge on acronyms. I won't say a word. Next time, please, let's, so I can understand it, because it changes every committee. My time is running out. The last thing, you know that I'm going to keep banging the drum on the MICLIC about mines and everything else. And as I said over and over again, that was used by me in Vietnam. And I'll tell you, I'm not 39. This was many, many years ago, and we're still using that stuff, and we still don't have it straight. So that's my big item. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our panel of witnesses for your testimony, and thank you for your service to the country. Secretary Jetty, I want to start with you, if I could. The Army's future years defense plan looks to shift more than $30 billion toward modernization, a bulk of which is under the purview of Army Futures Command. As you know, our enemies and adversaries have invested heavily in offsetting our advantages in a number of areas, particularly in the electromagnetic spectrum. I want to know, how is the Army building EW resiliency into modernization efforts to ensure that that new platforms and systems will function in a contested environment?
Thank you, sir, for the question, because it's one of my areas that I just find very important. I helped develop some of the critical systems for the Army's electronic warfare when I was back in uniform. EW remains essential to how we work on the battlefield. The bar keeps getting raised, and I think that we are working diligently, and it's a very challenging area, but we're working diligently to try and contend with that raising of the bar. How we can apply electronic energies to disrupting the opponent's electronic systems and how they can disrupt ours, it becomes more and more challenging as we go along. So we have to have an offsetting strategy. There's the offensive capability and the defensive capability. It used to be just simply a question of jamming and spoofing, and now what we're having to do is also assess each of these weapon systems for insertion. So it's a more sophisticated variant of spoofing by actually inserting things into the system and letting them run like a virus or to trick the systems. To do that, we literally start all the way down at the chip level in some cases. We will actually buy chips for critical systems, open them up, look at them, look at the second vendor's chips, open them up, make sure they're two dies. We know where the dies came from themselves. And we've been working our way from the supplier level up. We're doing reviews on our existing systems in that matter to make sure that they're not vulnerable. And then we're also, all of those steps are being incorporated in our assessment of the new systems.
I just want to make sure this remains obviously a high priority and remains dynamic, that it's not just a one and done, but obviously ongoing
Yes,
review and point counterpoint. So next, I want to also on that in the same area, on the cybersecurity front, we've seen a number of vulnerabilities identified in major systems through the 1647 process. So I want to know, is the Army positioned to finish its 1647 assessments by the statutory deadline?
I'm not sure I have a good answer for you, sir. I'll have to come back to you.
Okay, I appreciate that. And then as a follow-up to that, one of my concerns from the 1647 reviews is that lessons learned need to be fed back into the requirements development process. And so I also will ask, how are resiliency measures being baked into new acquisitions from the start? And given the dearth of metrics in the cybersecurity space, I also want to know what specific metrics you're using to ensure that delivered systems meet the requirements for resiliency. So if you need to get back to me on those, for the record, we can do that, but that's a priority that I'd like to get an answer to.
Yeah, we'll take that, sir. But I would add, so it all starts with the requirement. And so we talked about the 4 stars as part of the review process we had. So we still have a requirements process in place. And one of the things that General Milley put in place when he became the Chief of Staff of the Army was Army Cyber Command is part of the requirements process. So we look at, what we need for cyber protection before a requirement ever gets approved to ever go over to Dr. Jetty and be produced.
Okay, Well, thank you for that, and I look forward to the additional answers on the record. In your joint statement, you referenced directed energy effectors to address the air and missile defense mission. I'm specifically interested in the transition from initial mobile short-range air defense to directed energy systems, and wanted to ask if you can discuss your progress on these efforts so far, as well as how you're training soldiers to operate such systems.
So we've had several efforts with very small, low-power lasers that we call MFIX at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, against mostly small unmanned aerial vehicles, and those are real soldiers operating those to get feedback from the soldiers in terms of, you know, the interface with the firing mechanisms, the equipment, and we're seeing some great success in terms of small power lasers. The laser I think you're talking about is a higher power laser that right now we are planning to integrate into a larger air defense platform in around FY23. So right now we're focused on getting it out of S&T and getting it into development. And Dr. Jetty has graciously assigned a program executive officer to help us do that, which never had a PEO in the past, not only directed energy, but also hypersonics. And they are working very, very closely with the Air and Missile Defense CFT and the Long Range Precision Fire CFT.
Thank you. I know my time has expired, and I'm glad to hear you're getting ready to do the transitions once the technology matures. My message is get ready, because it's coming. I follow directed energy very closely, and it's getting out of the labs and getting to a maturity level that's going to be an effective capability for the warfighter. So, thank you. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We'll go from directed energy to simple ground combat. How's that for yin and yang? We had a brief, secure brief, a classified brief quite a bit ago on their situation in Europe, ground combat vehicles, tanks, their survivability and lethality, and upgrades were being done. You outline, and the GAO report outlines, this September 18 report on page 5, the process or the investments being made in Bradleys, in Strikers, and a variety of the ground combat vehicles, how much money is going to the plan to upgrade those additional armor brigades. Is that adequate near term to keep us in a position we are able to defend Eastern Europe at this point in time, in your opinion?
It is, in my opinion, sir, and I think, you know, one of the things we often overlook is we look at individual systems. The Army fights in formations.
Yes.
And when we looked at the Army Brigade Combat Team, the Abrams Tank, we are doing an upgrade to the Abrams, so we'll go to SEP V4.
Yep.
And that, in my opinion, that is still the most capable tank in the world. It's too heavy, but it's still the most capable tank in the world. And when we looked at an Armored Brigade Combat Team, the most vulnerable combat vehicle was the Bradley, and that's why we chose to replace it first.
Well, you're right, it is heavy. Is the number of Abrams you're talking about for Eastern Europe and these upgrades, are the adequate number over the term that's projected?
Deterrence is in the mind of the beholder,
It's
right?
believability, sure.
So one of the things we're looking at is posture. I mean, do we need to have more posture? And it's been talked about in hearings over the last 2 or 3 months. We can accomplish that in one of two ways, either through forward presence or a rotational basis. Right now, the Army is in a rotational basis, and I think that's appropriate. And I think here next calendar year, you will see an increase in the number of rotations, or possibly the size of the rotations and exercise we're doing to get after some of that. And then, of course, we just deployed a brigade on no-notice exercise from Fort Bliss, Texas, to draw the equipment we have pre-positioned and exercise it. And so we're working various ways to get after, I think, the mass that you're talking about.
It's just, in my opinion, necessary to keep that while we're modernizing, because I don't believe it's becoming any less dangerous a place in Eastern Europe.
Yes, sir. You have to be ready to fight tonight, and you have to be ready to fight 20 years from now, and that's the balance we're trying to achieve.
Let's talk a little bit about the next generation combat vehicle. The May 1st report talks about some of the unfortunate outcomes in terms of the future combat vehicle, and fair amount of money has been invested in this over a couple of efforts that have been, in fact, ended because they were premature at best. Are we comfortable at this point in time where the next generation combat vehicle is going in terms of that we're on track to accomplish that, in your opinion? We
are, and I'm very comfortable. And so one of the, besides the immature technologies, another problem we had with future combat system, there was, when you step back and look at it, there was no concept that it was supporting. So it was a pretty amazing capability if we got to it, but it really doesn't fit the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. So NGCV, OMFV, if you will, the optionally manned fighting vehicle, fits the MDO concept. So it is critical to the concept. So they're coming hand in hand, just like we did in the 70s and 80s with the Abrams and air-land battle. The other thing I would say is, in this case, it was mentioned before, these are mostly non-developmental vehicles. So these vehicles exist today. Now, there's going to be some integration challenges, and we're trying to make some upgrades, and we're watching that very, very closely to make sure the technology is mature enough. But for the most part, these vehicles exist today.
One last question for you. You mentioned optionally manned or autonomous combat vehicles, which are wonderful in concept. My concern is the ability of them to communicate in some form of control. Given the active electronic warfare we saw exhibited in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, we know you're well aware of the capabilities, so much so we can't talk here. I still haven't gotten a compelling answer as to how we are addressing that for these vehicles or for this technology. Can you give us any general information we can talk about later? Because I'm really concerned that we develop this capability.
Just very quickly, and I'm going to let Dr. Jetty talk to the specifics, but one of the reasons they are optionally manned as opposed to fully autonomous is what you bring up. So commander on the ground based upon a lot of different factors. One of them would be the electromagnetic spectrum. Do you choose to man the vehicle or do you choose to go teleoperated, really what we're talking about?
Sure, I think that you bring up a great point. One of the, when we talk about an unmanned system, getting to an unmanned system, a fully autonomous vehicle, I don't believe is around the corner. That's going to be quite a bit of work before we allow something to go off into the field with an armed weapon system to be able to fire at will. That leads you back to your question about how do I make sure I remain in control of it? And so that too has a lot of, well, I think this, but I haven't proven it yet. So we have a number of technology efforts ongoing. One of them, we've got a turret development program that we're working on right now, which is essentially taking a 30-millimeter turret, and I flip the button on. It finds the target. It classifies the target. It determines if it's a threat or not. It then categorizes which one's the most threatening. It does the fire solution, and then it can fire. And it can do that entire loop alone. That's the objective of the experiment. The reason is to then figure out where we put in the gates and where we can apply AI in the background to be able to manage that more effectively. We have a number of communications technologies that we're working on as well that are very nascent, that will enhance our ability to make sure we retain communications, but I'd rather discuss those in private with you.
Yeah, and I would ask, Mr. Chair, if we could do that at some point in time, is scheduled to have a conversation, a briefing on communication technologies for not only in this case, but these optionally manned or semi-autonomous vehicles and how they communicate under various threat scenarios, because it's starting to concern me that we've seen the ability to infiltrate those and damage that, and without the ability to communicate, our people in the field have a very difficult time responding, protecting themselves, or never mind defending the area. Thank you, and I yield back. Thank you, gentlemen.
Mr. Golden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, gentlemen, I'm new to the committee, and I am perhaps a little bit more at home in sea power, having served in the Marines and becoming familiar with the Army, and that's why I came here today. It's been helpful to sit here and listen to you all talk about this budget, about your modernization efforts, and go back and forth. So really, I think being the last one to ask a question, I'll just put something out there for you. Anything that you've missed that you'd like to talk about in regards to this modernization budget request and how it aligns with the NDS. Specifically, its emphasis on peer competition with larger forces like China or Russia and others. The entire time I served, I was in Afghanistan and Iraq. So, hearing your testimony, talking about some of the ways perhaps where some capabilities have atrophied over time as you focused on that mission, do you have any specific examples you haven't had an opportunity to talk about today that you'd like to throw out there that will help us understand why you're putting a priority on some of these new systems? What is it that you're worried that you've not been focused on over the last 18 years or so, or when you think about competitors of the future.
I'll just start it, but I think it's appropriate General Murray probably follows up. I think some of the questions we've got is why are we having to do this now? I would say because the capabilities we need for our soldiers in the future, they don't exist today in large part, and we have to start with the research and development now, and that's a lot of dollars we're having to move internally to do that, to produce, then eventually shift into procurement to put it in soldiers' hands by the time when we need it in our strategy. So that's some of the questions we've gotten is, 2028 seems like a long way away, but what we're trying to produce and what will be relevant in that potential future conflict against Russia or China does not exist today, and that's what we're asking General Murray to lead the way on.
And just so, to me, it always comes back to the concept. So simply, while you and I were involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, both the Russians and the Chinese watched how we fought back to Desert Storm and then the opening phases of Iraqi freedom, and they vowed never to face the United States Marine Corps, the United States Army in close combat. And so they have developed systems to establish standoff, much like a boxer uses a jab to keep somebody with shorter arms away from them. And so that's fundamentally what we saw in the Ukraine and with our next generation warfare study. And what we're seeing really in a lot of places like the South China Sea and along the coast of China is this problem called standoff. Different problem than we had during the Cold War, but a similar approach to how do we solve this standoff problem. And it's not just the Army, it's how do we enable the joint force to solve this standoff problem. And I think that's driving a lot of our modernization strategy.
So I think General Murray has it exactly right. Requirements drive the acquisition process. I spent a lot of time operationally. I spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan as well. While I'm an acquisition professional, I understand that there's no purpose in me developing something if it doesn't have operational value. So to that end, the number one requirement is let's take a look at what the potential adversaries are doing and how we can counter their capabilities. And the standoff is a significant one. If you take a look at Eastern Europe, you'll see the Russians doing exactly what he says. They do not want to get in a face-on-face fight with an M1 tank. Therefore, they put a large amount of rockets, artillery, and mortars, and they put air defenses in place to try and protect those assets. So we're adjusting our capability in long-range precision fires to be able to get at those, take out the protection measures that they've got in place for air defense, and then we've got defensive systems, particularly the directed energy we're putting in place to be able to counter the inbound systems as well.
Just a few seconds left here, but just so I have a greater understanding, you're telling me what they want to do. Is it still our goal then to defeat their efforts to hold us off so that you can close with them and get into that face-to-face, or are we changing a strategy and getting into more of a long-range fight as well?
So both. So we've changed the doctrine, and part of it is competing below the threshold of war, which is also going on each and every day, and you see it in the newspaper each and every day. So how do we get to a strategy where it's not black or white, we're at war or we're at peace, and it's conflict almost every day, or not conflict, excuse me, competition. And then, if it goes to conflict, that we have the ability to defeat that standoff that they're trying to achieve. And like I said, it's really to enable the joint force, because right now, the standoff they've created doesn't hold just the Army at bay. It holds really the joint force, except for some very expensive and exquisite capabilities. So how do you enable the joint force? And then really, how do you do this in such a way that we never have to use it? That we invest this money and we achieve deterrence, and we never have to prove that we can defeat that theory.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thanks so much for your service to our nation and coming in to testify today. General Murray, I want to begin with you. You had spoken in your opening testimony about the air and missile defense modernization priority, and specifically it was mentioned the Army's pursuing acquiring Iron Dome, and that, as you point out, it's an interim solution for indirect fire protection capability, specifically against unmanned aerial systems, cruise missiles, other projectiles coming in. certainly understand that. I know the Marine Corps is looking at the same sort of system as that indirect fire protection capability. In looking at what Israel has done and how effective Iron Dome is, they report that there's about a 90% effectiveness in taking down incoming targets through this interceptor system. That's good news. The challenging side is that it's about $100,000 per shot. So the Israelis have looked at directed energy. They've looked at the comparable system using laser family of systems called Iron Beam to be able to take out those threats at a much, much more efficient and cost-effective cost per shot. Can you give me your perspective on how the Army is looking at directed energy in its effort concerning indirect fire protection capability and how you see integrating that into your future doctrine?
Absolutely, sir. And so I have not heard of Iron Beam. I will definitely look into it. But in terms of directed energy strategy, so right now we are on a path to integrate directed energy onto our Stryker air defense vehicle, and I say roughly the 23 timeframe because we're still trying to pull it out of S&T, and I don't want to make too much of a bet too early that we'll be at 23. But that is absolutely the goal we're working towards. Effective against rockets, mortars, artillery, small UASs, that type of power of directed energy laser, if you will. And then there's also another S&T program that's on a much bigger truck, a much higher energy that would get after some larger targets that we are working on. And once again, not only hypersonics, but Dr. Jetty has been gracious enough to stand up a PEO office that is working, getting that through S&T, and so there is somebody there to catch it. So we're trying to cross that valley of death with these S&T efforts and make sure we can get them into a program of record.
That's great. Thank you, General Murray. Dr. Jetty, I wanted to get you maybe to elaborate on this and looking at how the Army is going about modernization. Can you comment a little bit more on how directed energy is going to be integrated into that effort? So it's not just things like laser family of systems, but it's high energy microwaves where you can address swarms of these potential adversarial platforms. Can you talk about that? There's a lot of technology going on in the other service branches as they're bringing this to bear. The other service branches, too, have very specific elements in their program decision-making for rapid prototyping, rapid acquisition to bring this technology, using COTS, commercially off-the-shelf available technology, trying to get that as quickly as we can to the warfighter. Can you speak a little bit about the Army's effort in that realm?
Yes, sir. So General Murray made the point that we've established a Rapid Capability and Critical Technology Office. It's headed by my senior PEO. He is a 3-star general. His background is in space and missiles, air defense, but he's very technically competent as well as programmatically competent, and it's been a real blessing to get him on hand. As we set that organization up, I established some specific efforts to frankly, find all of the cats. Everybody is out there working on something they call directed energy, and I'm trying to figure out what that really means and what they're really doing. So we think we know where most of the cats are, if not all of them. We are also beginning to herd them in. We're past that off. RCCTO has just been stood up in literally, I went down for the promotion ceremony for my 3-star a week and a half ago. So he is taking that role on to make it a formal program and clean that up. We do have ongoing efforts to move from a 10 kilowatt on a Stryker to a 50 kilowatt. The Navy, for example, has already a 100 kilowatt, and they're a nice 20-foot shipping container, but what makes lasers difficult is not just being able to put energy out the front end of it, it's keeping it cool so it doesn't melt. Yeah. It's powering it, it's getting the targeting data and all of those things. When you try to shrink all of that down and keep a continuous beam, it becomes very difficult. Yeah. They've got a ship to stick it on the front deck of and use all the other assets. We don't have that. Gotcha. My last thing is I'll say, yes, sir, we're doing some work in the other it's not just lasers in directed energy, and we're working in those areas as well, and they might be something better to talk about separately.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Sherrill?
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. Thank you, Dr. Jetty and General Murray, for visiting Picatinny and seeing the wonderful work the men and women do there. I know I heard some great things from the base about your visit, and I appreciate you taking the time to do that. Dr. Jetty, I believe that highly skilled acquisition professionals are exactly what we need to ensure that we modernize government-owned, contractor-operated ammunition facilities correctly. But it does concern me that modernization funding, which was recently moved from the equipping line of effort, where the Joint Program Executive Office had visibility and control, to the sustaining line of effort, creates a situation in which modernization funding could be tapped into for other priorities. Additionally, it creates a situation in which funding is not fully aligned with the responsibilities and authorities of the life cycle manager at Picatinny, and as a result, there's a lack of accountability. Will acquisition professionals at Picatinny who have the life cycle responsibility for ammunition, from development to production to maintaining to disposal, continue to receive the funding, authority, and responsibility to continue to remain responsible and fully accountable and funded for carrying out this important mission?
Thank you, ma'am, and thank you for we had a great time at Picatinny, and I appreciate the comments. This is a great area of importance to me. One of my top, when I was first coming into the job, I said I'm going to do top 10. What are my top 10? One of them is the development of the right talent base and putting them in the right place. So we have a significant program plan that develops the talent and makes sure that we have the right people in the right place and that they have proper training. Congress has been very gracious to the acquisition community in providing us methodologies by which we can send people to school if necessary, and all our constraints become our problem with timelines in their career path. To that end, the Secretary has stepped in and made a specific effort to find ways to mitigate any of the timeline issues in a person's career development. So I can see a significant improvement coming along. With respect to the funding moving from the EE-PEG to the SS-PEG, there's a little bit of a cheat in that because I'm the co-chair of the EE-PEG and I'm the co-chair of the SS-PEG. So I'm watching those funding lines specifically. I recently went down to the ammo plants, particularly I went to Halston and Radford. While the two plants are very functional, they are clearly, we need to work significantly on our tech base. I recently have been working with my military deputy for acquisition who works my uniform side and does most of my program management oversight for me. And we tentatively, so I'm being a little wishy-washy on my commitment because I'm trying to finish the details of it. But I see this as being a significant issue. These plants need more attention to a long-term program that meets the operational needs as we see them in the future. And the need to do that is not an incidental capability that's kind of put on the PEO armaments and ammunition. But he retains control because he controls the ammo, but we're looking at creating a strategic PM specifically to work on the GOCOs and make sure that those are properly planned and then the proper funding profiles get into the POM and that those programs actually modernize those plants, which are if you've been to them, are not terribly modern.
So my concern is simply that I think Picatinny has a great relationship in the full life cycle of the ammunition, and I think that has helped Picatinny, in some ways uniquely, bring their research and development to the field more quickly and more efficiently than what I've seen in many areas of our military. And so I guess with that as a model and as well as they are doing it, I'm concerned about changes to to what we might see coming, or I think there's a draft of transition to sustainment. I'm concerned about how that might affect the great work that Picatinny is doing.
Yeah, the transition to sustainment, so in the way that we deal with ammo, as soon as it's produced, it fundamentally transitions to sustainment. We hand it over to the command to store it and manage it until it gets to the point of disposal. Then there's sort of a linkage between the PEO for the ammunition and the AMC entity that manages the storage and transportation of the ammo. So it's treated very differently, and it's not this transition to sustainment where I've got a vehicle and we're trying to determine whether or not to pass it off to AMC as a completed vehicle with no further need for development. The Picatinny is essential. It is all the processes that we do at the plants come from Picatinny. My concern is that I don't think that the portion of the enterprise that does the actual production has the foresight to be able to develop better production plans for the capabilities Picatinny brings to the table, and then that's the part I'm trying to fix.
Well, I really appreciate you talking to me today. I would love to talk more about this and get a better understanding of how we can engage, because I do think that you see how important Picatinny has been to the modernization of our Army, and I just want to make sure we don't lose any of those critical capabilities. But thank you so much.
We're going into round two if you want to stick around, because as we went through and had our first set of questions, there was probably 2 months ago when there was a question of trying to move some funds around that we had within the Department of Defense for another item, the wall. And military construction leaked out of who was going to do it, and we got all the phone calls in the world. And I said, that's just a practice round for what we're doing today. And to try to explain that, as far as I know, there's never been this level of change in the history in terms of review, plus up, plus down, or eliminate. So when we're questioning, particularly me, getting into some of the deep-rooted questions of how the assessment is made, it's because I have 300 requests to change what you've just handed us in this request. So I know you understand that, but we just brought the example up on the industrial base. Once we dismantle, and it happens all the time, that industrial base, wherever it might be, because we're anticipating that next generation coming on in 5 years. And then in 5 years, it gets delayed, and we know how that goes. 4 years. You do not reassemble that industrial base, and that is much of our concern, in addition to all the risk assessments for the 6 priorities. And times that all 300 programs, because it's somebody's district, is why we're digging in. We better understand it. I get much better response when you dig deeper into these issues. And that's where I want to go now, is the relationship that you're standing up. Something as massive as this, not having more problems, means good basic design. So, Mr. Ludwigson, when we start looking at, and this is, Mikey had a great question. You'd like to have one size fit all, so there's uniformity, but the uniqueness of each of the programs that we have doesn't lend itself to that. When you're looking at the relationship that is going on now, from the acquisition side to the general's piece, is it working? We're early. Is there anything you would recommend in terms of tweaking, changing, getting feedback that you do each and every day that we can look at now, or potential for running into an issue later on?
So obviously, as when we did this work, it was early on, and we had great access across senior levels of the Army, as well as at Futures Command in its nascent form, looking at, in fact, talking to the CFT pilots and understanding what they were doing and understanding how they were transitioning across to Futures Command. I do think that there are important There are important transitions that are happening as they're moving to programs. That's part of the reason that we're emphasizing the idea that using mature technologies is important, and this idea of shifting from aspirational acquisitions toward more of an agile approach makes some sense from our standpoint. We didn't look at the specifics of the plus-ups or reductions or eliminations funding-wise. What we are doing is going forward in response to requests from this committee is we're going to look at ground combat vehicle. We have a slate of a couple of different programs that we're going to look at. So we'll look at ground combat vehicle as a portfolio, not just the optionally manned vehicle, but the slate. And then we'll burrow in to look at some of these other programs as it's appropriate and timely for the committee to look at. Because I think there are a couple of layers that the committee can pay attention to. It's the sort of the organizational element as well as sort of the program-specific side.
So I think there's good news in there. The main priority that I'm seeing and hearing from, particularly with those who are calling us up to say, is this a system that has been set up that is fundamentally fair to industry? And this is my question to you, generals. Why is this time different? And we talked about that because of the speed, the agility that you bring to this. Bringing industry with us is critical. There are those who say, well, we'll just wait this one out and come in under a new one, which is the worst thing we could do. What are we doing to bring industry with us, particularly given the fact that you did such a massive change, and some people have hurt feelings for a variety of reasons?
And I think one of the things that is fundamentally different this time is, and Dr. Jetty mentioned this, is the dialogue that is going on and has been going on with industry for a while. So Dr. Jetty mentioned the Secretary's Monday evening dinners, which he's pretty religious about, and either normally the chief or the vice would be there. And there was an attempt to, without bail, we can't communicate exactly what's in the budget before it's released. But there was an attempt, I know, by the Secretary and the Chief to communicate where we were going and why this was very, very important, that the Army is going to have to pivot sometime, and every day you wait is one day later before you make the pivot. And and what we were talking about, we've been very clear about communicating what our priorities are to include specific programs. And really what we're asking industry to do, and I have been in constant dialogue with industry, is meet us in the future. So we tend to look at this in terms of near-term losses, but there is tremendous opportunity as we begin to invest in the future, and that's been pretty much a consistent message to industry. It's come along with us.
Dr. J, do you see it essentially the same way? Particularly when we start going, that's just one measurement, the minimum sustained rate. Do you, independent of industry, create the number first, and then later on you go to industry, get their feedback, and adjust? I might have confused those two.
Yes, sir. Generally, what we do is we make our assessment and come up with a number.
Okay.
And then we go to industry because we may not know everything. And of course, particularly when you're talking about things like cost-plus contracts or cost-based contracts, we have access to their pricing data and their labor rates, their material buys, those type of things.
Listen, leaking that out for their stock prices alone can create havoc.
Yes, sir. Well, we're very good. We make sure that our people are very careful about not leaking out anything on those things, but then they go back and they make their own assessments to try and determine what the right numbers should be. We then have discussions. I have several calls a week with CEOs of major corporations and just work through these type of things. If I think that they're missing something, they think that I'm missing something, I'm always open to it, and we try to come to an agreement. It doesn't always occur that we agree, but at least we always know where our disagreement is.
Ms. Hartzler?
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask a question for one of my colleagues, one of our subcommittee members, Representative Bacon, who had to leave. And he wanted to know, how are you incorporating the ISR into your plans?
Yes, ma'am. So ISR, intel, surveillance, reconnaissance, I mean, it is a critical requirement today, and it's a critical requirement for the future, and it's only going to get more difficult because right now most of our ISR platforms would not survive on a modern lethal battlefield. So one of the things that we have done here recently, and it's really over the last about a 6-month effort, is start to link from a systems engineering standpoint requirements for not only ISR, but networks, communications, et cetera. And we are beginning to look here within the last couple of months, pretty hard at various ways of obtaining the ISR that we need from various altitudes on various platforms in various ways, and then getting that data where it needs to get to. And I'm kind of talking around it, but I think probably another session in a different setting would probably be appropriate. We can lay out specifically what we're talking about.
Great. That would be appreciated because it is very, very important. And along that lines, Dr. Jetty, what is the Army's plan to modernize the on-the-move network capability in the combat vehicles in your armored brigade combat teams?
So I know these may be words which sometimes cause people stress, but we had WinT, one, which was essentially a capability to get wideband communications on in a stationary mode, and it was oriented primarily on the primarily because that's the way we were fighting in Afghanistan, Iraq. We needed wide bands, and we were in fixed locations. The upgrade to that, so WinT1 is done, fielded, over. We're not doing anything, and then we moved to WinT2, which we've finished. I think we're pretty much finished up with it this year, the fielding of all aspects of it, and that gives us an ability to have the same type of wideband communications links while on the move at the brigade level. But we're not stopping there. So again, I go back, when you find a good horse, ride it a lot. So I have 4 strategic areas that have been assigned to my new senior PEO. One is the directed energy, one is hypersonics, one is space, and one is AI, and then the other one is AI. In the space area, that includes communications architecture. So we're working extensively to look at multiple options on how we can bring communications that are becoming available in the space realm to the battlefield and make it pervasively available. And again, sometimes when we get into the communication things, I'd rather talk about them in a closed forum than an open forum.
That sounds good. So we've had some discussion about the optionally manned fighting vehicle already. And I know you intend to bring that out with the Middle Acquisition Authority to replace the Bradley fighting vehicle. I guess my question that hasn't been asked about is how many vendors do you expect to compete for this contract? And what will the Army do if only one original equipment manufacturer submits a proposal?
So I did require the PEO, when they drew up the document, that it said up to, and not 1 or 2 vendors. And I did that particularly to leave the Army room in case we ended up with just one reply to the solicitation, because I didn't want us cornered into a position where we had to take a vendor and that was the only vendor that made an offer. So if we get no vendors that give an offer, of course, we'll retry. If we get one, we can retry, and what we'll do is we'll look at the offer and make a determination as to whether or not it's sufficient to go ahead with. We don't expect that to be the case at this point. We know from the questions that we've gotten back at the different industry PEO sessions, we think we're probably going to have 3 or 4 submissions.
Very good. That'll be interesting to see how that comes out. So I recently visited the Aviation Classification Repair Activity Depot, AVCRAD, in Springfield, Missouri. And this depot was very interesting. It was converting the UH-60A Alpha models to the UH-60L Lima models. These are Black Hawk helicopters. And and which is an upgrade over the old Alpha models and will improve the Army National Guard capability. However, as you know, the Lima models are still operating on analog gauges and they lack digitized capability. So I understand that the Army's UH-60V Victor program will upgrade the Lima models with an advanced digital cockpit, among other upgrades, effectively making these helicopters comparable to the UH-60M Mike model, which is the most advanced Black Hawk helicopter. So Dr. Jetty, what is the status of the Army's UH-60V program, and is this program still a priority for the Army across the future years defense program?
Thank you. Okay, I have 841 programs and 512 research projects, so I'm not sure I'm going to give you the exact answer you want, and I'll be happy to come back with a more detailed one. Perhaps General Murray can close, but Victor's important, and particularly just for you to feel comfortable with respect to the National Guard. If you talk about aviation assets and the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army's in the room, you'd better not do anything that negates the capability of the National Guard with respect to their aviation assets.
So I will just interject before General Murray. I do have an Army Guard Black Hawk unit at Whiteman at in my district. It's my understanding that only the Victor models and the Mike models can be deployed. And that's not correct?
I'm sorry, it was on before I turned it off. So you mentioned Alphas, Victors, Limas, Mikes, and you did well keeping those straight. The Alpha model is the oldest model aircraft that we have in terms of the Black Hawk. It will be out of the National Guard, I think, in 22 or 23, and out of the active component in 25. So we will actually divest the Alpha model. There is no Alpha to Victor conversion or Alpha to Lima. I'm very familiar with the Lima. My son-in-law flies one. The Lima to Victor conversion, we were looking at options on that. The Secretary has said publicly, and we are, obviously, since he has set this mark on the wall, we are fully committed to converting all the Limas to Victor in both the active component, the regular Army, the National Guard, and the U.S. Army Reserve, and then continuing with the Mike model procurement. And so we would have a pure fleet of Mike and Victor at some point in the future. And you are absolutely correct. It turns an analog aircraft, at least from the cockpit perspective, into a digital aircraft. And we would, right now, probably because the Victors and the Mikes are our newest model aircraft, that's probably why they're deploying. I don't think there's a restriction on a Lima aircraft deploying, especially in terms of like medevac aircraft.
I would just say, just from the cost of the aircraft, a Mike model is just under $20 million a copy, and we can get a Victor, which is essentially just about the same as a Mike, for about $12 million. So from a budget perspective, it's very helpful.
When I came away from that visit, I became a fan of the Victor model. So I concur with that. And one last question I have, General Murray and Dr. Jetty, I'm concerned about the proliferation of advanced threats to Army rotorcraft platforms. How are you staying ahead of these threats, and what actions are you currently taking to ensure all rotorcraft programs have the most advanced aircraft survivability equipment?
I'll start off from requirements side, if I could, ma'am. So absolutely, and in many cases, the threat is proliferating, as you mentioned, in a lot faster than we had anticipated, 5, 10 years ago. And so there's constant advances in terms of threats to rotorcraft. From a today perspective, we are continuing to upgrade what we have in prioritizing units that are deploying. So where it is most needed is where it's going. There are several programs that Dr. Jetty and I talked about a couple of days ago that would have to be done in a different session, different setting as we start looking into threats in the future.
The one that most I can discuss here most is our Kirkham, which is a.
I'm sorry, could you say what?
Kirkham.
Kirkham.
The Kirkham system it's an advanced threat detection and defense system that the helicopters will have deployed on them. Exactly how it works, I'd rather reserve for a separate discussion. But we have a solid program. We when I came in, there were some technical challenges. We put a team against it, solved them, and now the system's fully online to go forward. As General Murray has stated, the two of us have done a review of all our special access programs in detail and their applicability, just the same thing as we did with all the open programs. And there are a number of things there that address some of the issues here.
Great. I'm very encouraged by that, and appreciate all of your being here today and all that your work. And I'm done with my questions. I yield back. Thank you.
Let me try to wrap this up. We had a conversation at Picatinny, the EMP, and hardening. As a new system's developed, you spoke cyber, you're reviewing it every step of the way. Do you see a need to create a little bit more strict view of the EMP hardening of assets, new versus retro? Where do you see this going, particularly with Russia and China?
Well, so once again, it all comes back to requirements, and then I'll let Dr. J talk about it. So there actually is, in the joint process, a requirement to look at survivability and nuclear effects, EMP is what you're talking about. I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, but we're also, the physical end of the EMP isn't the kinetic piece, just the pulse that
Oh, yes, sir.
And there's some other things, as you know, that.
No, I understand exactly what you're talking about. And sometimes, though, and we have this debate often during the requirements process for, like, let's say a rifle.